Hey there, folks, Carl here. You know me, local columnist, storyteller, and all-around nosy guy who gets the scoop on just about everything in this town. But today, I've got a story for you that left even me speechless, and trust me, that's no small feat. Now picture this, a quiet neighborhood, the kind where folks leave their doors unlocked and wave to each other on the way to church. But on this one night, the silence was broken by the sound of breaking glass, splintering wood, and malicious laughter. A group of local troublemakers, young, drunk, and full of hatred, had decided to send a message. The target of their hate? A small, modest house that belonged to a black woman named Cassandra Harris. They smashed her windows, spray-painted vile slurs on her walls, and set fire to her garden, laughing as they watched the flames dance in the moonlight. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams, was who Cassandra Harris really was. You see, Cassandra wasn't just the quiet woman who kept to herself and worked at the local animal shelter. No, sir. Cassandra Harris was a former operative in one of the most elite and dangerous special forces units this country has ever known. Her training was the stuff of legend, her missions classified so deep not even the president could access them without clearance. And those boys? Well, they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. But just as Cassandra stepped out of the shadows, her face calm, her hands steady, carrying something that glinted in the moonlight, something that made the boys freeze where they stood, we have to pause. Because to really understand what happened next, you've got to know who Cassandra Harris is and how we got here. Trust me, this is a story you'll want to hear. It all started about 6 months ago, when Cassandra first moved into town. She'd picked this quiet corner of the world to get away from, well, everything. You see, Cassandra had spent nearly 2 decades serving her country, completing missions so dangerous that most people wouldn't even believe they were real. She'd operated in the shadows, taking down threats and saving lives, but at a cost. The life of a soldier, especially one in her line of work, isn't easy. She lost friends, she lost sleep, and eventually, she lost herself. So when she retired, she decided she wanted peace. No more danger, no more violence. Just a simple life with her rescue dog, Charlie, and a garden full of wildflowers. At first, the neighbors didn't quite know what to make of her. Cassandra wasn't exactly chatty, but she was polite. She always said hello when she walked Charlie down the street and even baked cookies for the neighborhood kids on Halloween. But there was something about her, something in the way she carried herself, that made people curious. There were whispers, of course. Some folks said she used to be a spy. Others said she was running from the mob. Most people just shrugged it off and figured she was harmless. But not everyone was so welcoming. There were a few people in town, let's just call them what they are, racists, who didn't take too kindly to having a black woman in what they considered their neighborhood. At first, it was just little things. Snide comments at the grocery store. Glares when she walked by. Cassandra ignored it. She dealt with worse in her life. But over time, things started to escalate. Someone slashed her car tires. Another time, she found her mailbox stuffed with garbage. Cassandra didn't say a word to anyone. She just replaced the tires, cleaned out the mailbox, and went about her business. And then came the night of the attack. It started with the sound of shattering glass. Cassandra had been sitting on her porch, sipping tea, when she heard it. She set her cup down, walked inside, and saw them, 3 young men, wearing hoodies, holding baseball bats and spray paint cans. They were laughing, smashing her windows, and painting disgusting words on her house. One of them lit a match and tossed it into her garden, setting it ablaze. Cassandra stood there for a moment, watching them. Then she did something that would change everything. She walked out onto the porch, calm as you please, and called out to them. "Hey boys," she said, her voice steady. The men froze. Something about her tone made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. She took another step forward, her hands behind her back. "I think you've had your fun." One of the men sneered. "What are you going to do about it, lady?" And that's when Cassandra pulled out the knife. It wasn't just any knife, it was military grade, sharp enough to slice through bone. She held it like she knew exactly how to use it, which of course she did. Her eyes locked onto the men, and for the first time, they realized they might have made a mistake. "Leave," she said, her voice cold. "Now." But they didn't leave. And what happened next? Well, let's just say it's the kind of story that'll keep you up at night. Stay tuned, folks. This one's just getting started. The men didn't leave. One of them, a wiry guy with a buzz cut and too much to prove, took a step forward instead, gripping his baseball bat like it was an extension of his arm. "What are you gonna do, Grandma?" he sneered. The other two laughed, though their chuckles sounded nervous now. Cassandra didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She just stood there, holding that knife like it was an old friend. "Put the bat down," she said, her voice calm, almost too calm. It was the kind of tone you'd use with a toddler about to throw a tantrum. But the guy wasn't having it. He raised the bat, aiming it right at her, and that's when it happened. Cassandra moved so fast it didn't seem real. 1 second, she was standing on the porch, and the next she was behind him, twisting his arm in a way arms weren't supposed to twist. The bat clattered to the ground as the guy yelped in pain, his bravado evaporating like morning dew. She pushed him away, and he stumbled, clutching his shoulder and looking at her like she was a ghost. The other two didn't know what to do. They stood there frozen, caught between fight and flight. Cassandra turned her gaze on them, and that was enough. They dropped their spray cans and bolted, their feet pounding the pavement as they disappeared into the night. Buzzcut, nursing his arm, wasn't far behind. For a moment, everything was quiet again. The flames in the garden had burned themselves out, leaving a blackened patch of earth and the faint smell of smoke. Cassandra exhaled, lowering the knife. She bent down, picked up the baseball bat, and walked back inside, locking the door behind her. But that was just the beginning. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. Word had gotten out about the attack, about how Cassandra had handled it. Some people were impressed, even a little scared. Others were angry, accusing her of overreacting. It didn't take long for the story to spread, and soon, it reached the ears of the three men who had started it all. They weren't happy, to say the least. Now, here's where things take a turn. The leader of that little group, a guy named Travis, wasn't the kind of person to let things go. He was mean, entitled, and used to getting his way. His daddy owned half the town, and he'd never faced any real consequences in his life. So instead of taking his bruised ego and moving on, he decided to escalate. A few days later, Cassandra woke up to find her front yard littered with trash, empty beer cans, torn up newspapers, and broken glass. Her garden, already damaged from the fire, had been completely destroyed, trampled into the dirt. But it wasn't just the mess that caught her attention. Stuck to her front door was a note, written in big sloppy letters. "Asterisk, you don't belong here." Asterisk. Cassandra stared at the note for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she calmly pulled it down, crumpled it into a ball, and tossed it in the trash. She didn't say a word about it to anyone. She didn't need to. But that night, something inside her shifted. Cassandra had spent years learning how to defend herself and others, how to neutralize threats and stay one step ahead of her enemies. She hadn't wanted to use those skills again, not here, not in this quiet little town. But it was becoming clear that her past wasn't going to stay in the past. And if these boys were going to keep pushing, well, they were about to find out exactly what she was capable of. Meanwhile, Travis was planning his next move. He couldn't believe what had happened. How had some middle-aged woman, no, some black woman, managed to humiliate him like that? It didn't sit right with him, and he wasn't about to let it go. So he rallied his friends, 3 more this time, and came up with a plan. If Cassandra thought she could scare them off, she had another thing coming. The following weekend, just after midnight, Cassandra heard a noise outside. This time, it wasn't the sound of breaking glass or spray cans. It was heavier, more deliberate, like someone was trying to pry open her front door. She moved quickly, grabbing the knife she kept on the counter and slipping into the shadows near the staircase. Charlie, her dog, growled low in his throat but stayed by her side, waiting for her signal. The door creaked open, and she saw them, 6 men, all armed with bats, crowbars, and the kind of confidence that comes from thinking you're untouchable. Cassandra's heart pounded, but not from fear. She crouched low, silent as a ghost, her eyes fixed on the intruders. They stepped inside, their footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. One of them, Travis, called out, "Come on out, lady. Let's see how tough you really are." Cassandra didn't respond. She waited, her grip on the knife steady, her breath slow and even. She knew this was it, the moment she'd been trying to avoid. But now that it was here, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, the rush of adrenaline, the sharp focus that came with knowing the stakes. And then, just as Travis turned the corner, she moved. What happened next? Well, let's just say it's the kind of thing that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about the quiet woman at the end of the street. Stay tuned, folks. The story's just heating up. Travis turned the corner, a smug grin plastered across his face, his crowbar swinging loosely at his side. He thought this was going to be easy. He thought Cassandra was just some lonely, defenseless woman who'd made the mistake of standing up to him. He couldn't have been more wrong. Before he even realized what was happening, Cassandra struck. She came at him from the shadows, moving with the kind of speed and precision that only years of training could teach. 1 second, Travis was standing there, ready to taunt her. The next, his legs were swept out from under him, and he hit the floor with a loud thud. The crowbar clattered from his hand and slid across the floor. "Stay down," Cassandra said, her voice low and calm. But Travis, fueled by pride and anger, didn't listen. He lunged for her, but she sidestepped easily, twisting his arm behind his back in one fluid motion. He yelped in pain, his confidence evaporating like water on a hot stove. Cassandra didn't even break a sweat. By now, the other men had heard the commotion. They rushed into the room, their weapons raised, expecting to see Travis in control. Instead, they found him pinned to the floor, Cassandra's knee pressing into his back. For a moment they froze, unsure of what to do. Then one of them, a tall guy with a shaved head, roared and charged at her with his bat raised high. Big mistake. Cassandra released Travis and spun to face her new attacker. She stepped into his swing, blocking it with her arm and driving the hilt of her knife into his ribs. The air left his lungs in a whoosh, and he stumbled back, clutching his side. Another man tried to rush her from behind, but Cassandra was ready. She grabbed a lamp from the table and swung it, shattering it against his head. He went down like a sack of bricks. By this point, the remaining 3 men were starting to realize they'd bitten off more than they could chew. But instead of retreating, they doubled down. They surrounded her, each of them holding a weapon, trying to box her in. Cassandra took a deep breath, her eyes scanning their positions, her mind racing. This wasn't just a fight anymore, it was a chess match, and she was 5 moves ahead. The first man swung his crowbar at her head, but she ducked, the metal whistling past her ear. She grabbed his wrist, twisting it until he dropped the weapon with a cry of pain. Then she spun him around and shoved him into the second man, sending them both crashing into a side table. The third man hesitated, his bat trembling in his hands. Cassandra locked eyes with him, her expression unreadable. "Go home," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You don't want this fight." For a moment, it seemed like he might listen. But then Travis, still sprawled on the floor, shouted, "Don't let her scare you. She's just one woman." That was all it took to push him over the edge. He charged at her, swinging wildly, but his lack of control was his downfall. Cassandra sidestepped his attack, grabbed his arm, and flipped him onto his back with a move so fast it was almost a blur. Travis, meanwhile, had managed to scramble to his feet. His face was red with fury, and he was breathing hard, but he wasn't ready to give up. He grabbed the crowbar again and lunged at her, shouting, "You're dead, lady." Cassandra didn't even flinch. She stepped into his swing, disarming him with a move so smooth it looked like second nature. The crowbar hit the floor, and before Travis could react, she delivered a sharp, controlled kick to his chest, sending him sprawling across the room. He landed hard, groaning in pain. By now, the fight was over. The men who could still stand were dragging their injured friends toward the door, their bravado gone. Travis tried to get up, but Cassandra stood over him, her knife glinting in the dim light. "Listen to me," she said, her voice steady and commanding. "You don't come back here. You don't bother me. You don't bother anyone else in this town. Because if you do, I won't be this nice next time. Do you understand?" Travis nodded, his face pale. He scrambled to his feet and followed his friends out the door, limping and clutching his chest. For a long moment, the house was silent again. Cassandra stood there, breathing deeply, her knife still in her hand. Charlie padded over to her and nuzzled her leg, as if to say, "It's over now." But Cassandra knew better. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Later that night, as she cleaned up the mess and bandaged her arm, she'd taken a hit during the fight, though she barely felt it. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Travis wasn't the kind of person to take defeat lying down, and she'd humiliated him in front of his friends. Sure enough, as she looked out the window, she spotted a car parked across the street. Its engine was off, but she could see the faint glow of a cigarette in the driver's seat. Someone was watching her. Cassandra sighed, her grip tightening on the knife. If they thought they could scare her, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Stay tuned, folks. This story's about to take a darker turn. The car outside didn't leave. Cassandra watched it from her darkened living room, her silhouette hidden behind the heavy curtains. The faint glow of the cigarette flickered on and off, the only sign of life inside the vehicle. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They were waiting. Charlie let out a low growl at her feet, sensing the tension in the air. Cassandra reached down to scratch behind his ears, a calming gesture more for herself than for him. "It's okay, boy," she murmured. But deep down, she knew this was anything but okay. After an hour, the car's headlights finally flicked on, and it slowly rolled down the street. Cassandra memorized the license plate as it passed under a streetlight, her sharp mind filing the information away. She knew better than to relax, though. If they were bold enough to sit outside her house tonight, it was only a matter of time before they made their next move. And she was right. The next day, she found her mailbox smashed to pieces, its contents scattered across her front yard. A crude drawing of a noose had been scrawled on one of the envelopes in red marker. Cassandra stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The act was cowardly, amateurish. But it wasn't the act itself that concerned her, it was the escalation. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop until they got what they wanted. She cleaned up the mess without a word. No calls to the police, no complaints to the neighbors. Cassandra knew how these people operated. They wanted a reaction. They wanted her scared, humiliated, running out of town with her tail between her legs. But Cassandra Harris didn't run. Not anymore. That night, she prepared. She sharpened her knife, locked her doors, and double-checked the placement of every security camera she'd installed when she first moved in. Her house wasn't just a home, it was a fortress, built with the kind of foresight that came from years of survival. These men thought they were predators, but they were about to learn they'd been hunting the wrong prey. Sure enough, the attack came 2 nights later. It was around midnight when Cassandra woke to the sound of breaking glass. This time, it wasn't a single bottle or window, it was a full-on assault. Rocks smashed through her living room windows, and she could hear the crunch of boots on gravel as several people crept toward the house. Cassandra moved quickly, silently, grabbing the knife from her bedside table and slipping into the shadows. Charlie was at her side, his ears perked, his body tense. She gave him a quick hand signal, and he darted off toward the back of the house. The intruders didn't realize it yet, but they'd walked straight into a trap. They moved cautiously, whispering to each other, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. One of them, a stocky guy in a ski mask, climbed through the broken window, landing with a grunt on the hardwood floor. He gestured for the others to follow. Soon, there were 4 of them inside, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. "Spread out," one of them whispered. "Find her." But Cassandra found them first. The first man didn't even see her coming. She struck from the shadows, disarming him in a single swift motion and taking him down with a controlled choke hold. He hit the floor silently, unconscious before he could make a sound. Cassandra dragged him into a corner and melted back into the darkness. The second man heard the faint scuffle and turned toward the noise, his flashlight sweeping the room. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice shaky. He took a cautious step forward, but before he could react, Cassandra dropped from the staircase above, landing behind him and delivering a sharp blow to the back of his neck. He crumpled to the ground. The remaining 2 men panicked. "She's here," one of them shouted, his voice cracking. They huddled together, their flashlights darting wildly across the room. And then the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, the hum of electricity replaced by an eerie silence. The men cursed, fumbling with their flashlights, their confidence quickly unraveling. From the shadows, Cassandra's voice rang out, calm and steady. "You shouldn't have come here." One of the men swung his bat wildly, hitting nothing but air. The other fumbled with his phone, trying to turn on the flashlight, but his hands were shaking too much to get a grip. They were blind, scared, and completely at her mercy. And Cassandra? She was in her element. The fight that followed wasn't a fight at all, it was a lesson. Cassandra neutralized them one by one, using the darkness to her advantage, her movements precise and deliberate. By the time the lights flickered back on, all 4 men were incapacitated, lying in various states of disarray on the floor. Cassandra stood in the middle of the room, her breathing steady, her knife glinting under the harsh overhead light. She looked down at the men and shook her head. "You're lucky I'm not who I used to be," she said quietly. "Because if I were, none of you would be walking out of here." She called the police then, her voice calm as she reported the break-in. She gave them just enough information to ensure the men would be taken into custody, but not enough to invite too many questions. Cassandra Harris liked to keep her secrets. As the police arrived and loaded the intruders into their cars, Cassandra stood on her porch, watching. She knew this wouldn't be the end. People like Travis didn't stop, they escalated. And if he wasn't part of this group, he was planning something worse. But Cassandra wasn't afraid. She'd been through worse. And if they came for her again, she'd be ready. Stay tuned, folks. The storm is far from over. The quiet after the attack didn't last long. It never does in stories like these. The men Cassandra had taken down were carted off to the police station, but the small-town whispers started almost immediately. People wondered how a middle-aged woman had managed to take out 4 armed intruders without so much as breaking a sweat. The rumors grew wilder by the day. Some said she was a former CIA agent. Others claimed she had supernatural powers. Cassandra ignored them all. She knew the truth, and that was enough. But the whispers weren't the only thing spreading. Travis hadn't been among the men who broke into her house that night. No, he was planning something bigger. Something he thought would finally break her. He was done with scare tactics. He wanted revenge. It started with small, calculated moves. Her bank account was frozen one morning due to suspicious activity. Cassandra spent hours on the phone trying to straighten it out, only to find out the issue had originated from an anonymous report. A few days later, Animal Control showed up at her door with a warrant to take Charlie, claiming he was a dangerous breed and had been involved in an attack. The report was, of course, completely fabricated, and Cassandra managed to shut it down. But it was clear, Travis was trying to make her life miserable. Cassandra didn't retaliate. Not yet. She knew better than to fight fire with fire, not until she understood the full scope of his plan. So she watched. She listened. And slowly but surely, she began to piece it all together. Travis wasn't working alone. He'd recruited a small group of like-minded men, people with too much hate and too little sense. They called themselves the Guardians, as if their actions were noble, as if terrorizing a woman for the color of her skin was some kind of heroic act. Cassandra had seen men like them before, during her time in the service. They were bullies, cowards who thrived on intimidation but crumbled under real pressure. And she was about to bring that pressure. It all came to a head one stormy Friday night. Cassandra had been preparing for this moment for weeks, carefully laying the groundwork for what she knew was coming. She doubled down on her home's defenses, reinforced the locks, and installed motion sensors in every corner of her property. But she didn't stop there. Cassandra wasn't just defending herself, she was going on the offensive. That night, the storm raged outside, thunder rattling the windows and lightning illuminating the darkened streets. Cassandra sat in her living room, her knife on the table beside her, her eyes fixed on the monitors that displayed the feeds from her security cameras. She didn't have to wait long. At exactly midnight, the cameras picked up movement. 4 vehicles pulled up outside her house, their headlights cutting through the rain. A dozen men climbed out, armed with bats, crowbars, and gasoline cans. Travis was among them, his face twisted with determination. He'd brought an army this time, convinced that sheer numbers would tip the scales in his favor. Cassandra's pulse quickened, but not from fear. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This wasn't just a fight for her home. This was a fight for her peace, her dignity, her right to exist without being harassed. And she wasn't going to lose. The men approached the house, their voices barely audible over the storm. Travis led the way, his crowbar slung over his shoulder like a trophy. "Let's show her what happens when you mess with us," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. But as they reached the porch, something unexpected happened. The lights around the house suddenly flared to life, illuminating the yard like a stadium. The men froze, squinting against the brightness, their confidence faltering. And then they heard her voice. "You're trespassing," Cassandra said, her words amplified by a hidden speaker. "Leave now, and I won't have to hurt you." The men exchanged nervous glances, but Travis wasn't backing down. "Come out here and say that to my face," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. Cassandra didn't answer. Instead, the sprinklers turned on, dousing the men in freezing water. But it wasn't just water, it was laced with a dye that stained their clothes and skin a bright fluorescent orange. The men cursed and stumbled back, their confidence unraveling with every passing second. Travis, soaked and furious, charged up the steps and kicked the front door. It didn't budge. He kicked it again, harder this time, and it swung open. "Let's go," he yelled, motioning for the others to follow. They stormed into the house, but what awaited them wasn't what they expected. The lights inside flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. A high-pitched alarm blared from hidden speakers, disorienting them. And then, one by one, they started to fall. Cassandra struck from the shadows, taking them down with calculated precision. A well-placed kick here, a strike with the hilt of her knife there. She moved like a ghost, her training on full display. The men didn't stand a chance. One tried to fight back, swinging his bat wildly, but Cassandra disarmed him in seconds, leaving him sprawled on the floor, gasping for air. By the time she reached Travis, he was alone, his army reduced to a groaning pile of bodies scattered across the house. He held his crowbar tightly, his hands shaking. "You think you're so tough," he spat, trying to mask his fear. "You're nothing." Cassandra stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. "If I'm nothing, then what does that make you?" she said, her voice calm but laced with steel. Travis swung the crowbar, but Cassandra caught it mid-swing, twisting it out of his grip and tossing it aside. He stumbled back, falling to the floor. She stood over him, her knife glinting in the dim light. "This ends now," she said. "You're done." The sound of sirens in the distance cut through the storm, growing louder with every second. Travis's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. Cassandra had called the police before they'd even arrived, ensuring there would be no escape. As the officers pulled up and began hauling the men away, Travis looked at Cassandra one last time. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice weak. But Cassandra just smiled, her expression unreadable. "Oh, it's over," she said. "You just don't know it yet." As the last of the men were taken away, Cassandra stood on her porch, the storm finally beginning to subside. The battle was over, but the war? That was a different story. Stay tuned, folks. Cassandra Harris isn't done yet.